Maker-centered learning. Maker-centered learning is very much what it sounds like. It is learning that is centered around creating. There is some debate as to what the term maker-centered learning actually means. To label it a cultural shift may be a disservice to those who already spend the majority of their lives making items, such as bakers and carpenters. However, for the context of this presentation, let us put this argument aside to focus on what maker-centered learning means to the class. Since the Second World War, we have gone from being a nation of makers to a throwaway nation. And in a typical classroom, students are ranked and pitted against one another through individual assignments, daily classroom testing, and standardized testing. Where in a maker-centered classroom, students would synergize and are able to bounce ideas off of one another. Teaching skills in isolation is no longer effective. In order to be competitive in a 21st century market, students must learn to create and solve problems in a cross-curricular method. Teaching to the test has created a generation of students who are afraid to fail, and this is counterproductive to the current need of modern companies. Intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation is what a student wants to do because it brings them personal satisfaction, not because they will get a reward from someone. In an article titled The Long Death of Creative Teaching, teacher blogger Jose Vincent said, "People who advocate for the Common Core standards miss the bigger picture. They came as a package deal with the new teacher evaluations, higher stakes testings, and austerity measures, including school closings. The Common Core is just the last of a series of politicized and incentivized business models inappropriately being applied to education. We must remember that curriculum and data are not the end-all be-all, rather the means to an end, which in this case is a well-rounded individual who is able to think and create their way into and out of just about any situation that may present itself. China has discovered that great emphasis on standardized testing has stunted the creative and social growth of its students and has had a negative impact on motivation. As a result, China is changing its educational approach to include more emphasis on creativity, character training, and discovery of development and unique. In order to prepare our students for the world, we must be flexible and teach not only the basic curriculum, we must be ready to and willing to back up and punt, as it were, and be flexible when the framework of our curriculum and to meet the students where they are, to nurture them to where they need to be and beyond. Unlike traditional methods, maker-centered learning lends itself to the power of choice. A plus B no longer necessarily equals the only way to get to C, and if we give students the opportunity to discover this concept, we may have a plethora of different kinds of C's to choose from. Teachers must remember to give clear feedback and time. We can support the creative processes by developing thinking routines. First, we must teach our students how to look slowly at the parts, purposes, and complexities of an object. Then we must teach students to look even deeper at the parts, people, and interactions involved in an item and its system. And finally, we must think about the system and what's one role in it. What emotions does it evoke, and what are the motivation and priorities of using the object? When the students can use these thinking skills independently and as a group, they will begin to really develop some critical thinking skills. One can't simply tell children to create and expect them to know what to do. Creative thinking skills must be explicitly taught and used within the curriculum. It's also helpful to give students real-world examples of creative thinkers, both historically and locally. Consider inviting some local creative thinkers to tinker with your class. These could include artists, mechanics, plumbers, and engineers. Look for examples of creative thinkers in fields you might not expect, like the medical field or the. There are many benefits to maker-centered learning. It lends itself to intrinsic motivation, and learning goes beyond the required. Synergy becomes an advantage rather than a requirement when students are working together to explore and discuss as a team. When the fear of being measured against one another has been taken away, and when the realization that together we understand more, notice more, and succeed more occurs, then the students will begin to develop and more nuanced understanding of what they are discovering or creating, and will begin to use critical thinking skills more regularly. One of the blockages to maker-centered learning is the traditional mindset. Carol Dweck introduced the idea of a growth mindset that encourages students to persevere through learning obstacles to obtain new understanding. Also, a lack of money is a problem. It will take some creative maker-centered thought on the part of the teacher to bring changes in her classroom to fruition. The Common Core curriculum does not need to be an obstacle if one remembers that it is a base that we may add to, work around, and make our own. To punish teachers for things out of the circle of their control is unconscionable. So how do we create this utopia of education? A flipped classroom is one way. It allows for 10% of the time to focus on teaching, and then 90% of the time is allowed to be focused on application. For tinkering stations, an old adage states, one man's trash is another man's treasure. And in the case of tinkering stations, it's true. They can be set up at a minimum cost with some creativity. There's also digital storytelling and robotics like Little Sphero and Little Bits. This month, my students and I have been studying movement makers like Cesar Chavez, Martin Luther King Jr., and Mahatma Gandhi. These are all individuals who, through creativity and determination, changed the way the world thinks. As a teacher, making the change from a traditional classroom to a maker-centered classroom can be daunting. However, with heart, resourcefulness, and perseverance, you can be the change maker.